You kids have it easy today. When I was starting out building combat robots, we had to get our crappy parts from Wal-Mart. So welcome everyone. I've had this pile of parts, more I guess you call it a pile of parts, sitting around my house for quite a while now, so I thought it'd be fun to take a look at it and see what the history of 12-pound combat robots, at least kind of the cheaper, easier to build ones, was about 20 years ago. So this is Mini Flash, my old, as I mentioned, 12-pound combat robot. Now this exact version never actually fought in the arena, but earlier versions of it fought several times at NERC events back around 2001 to 2003, in that time range. This particular version was probably built about 2003, so we're talking, you know, 2 financial crises ago. I think Amazon was still trying to find a stadium large enough to hold all the books they sell. So yes, you got to get crap from Walmart. So let's take a look at this robot, kind of how it was built, and you'll see how different things were back then compared to what is going on today. So let's start by talking about the frame of this robot. And I would say it's, well, very poorly built. It's mostly hand cut, as there were some power tools involved, and if it was some sort of sawzall. It wasn't even a jigsaw at the time. Oh, it did have a drill press, which was a nice upgrade. A lot of the parts were hand measured and cut that way. There really wasn't anything that really looked like CAD involved. I'll comment on that in a minute. And the reason for that is a lot of cool things like machine tools. Well, they did exist back then. CNC machining was a thing, lathes were a thing. But they weren't nearly as accessible as they are today. There weren't sites where you could upload a file and get a nice machine piece sent to you. 3D printing did exist at some point at some commercial level, but there weren't home 3D printers, and it wasn't something people were really even talking about. And CAD, well, 3D CAD was a thing, but there weren't a lot of good free options like there are today. There was something called Rhino 3D. It wasn't free, but it offered a free trial. And I want to say the limitation of the free trial was you got like 30 saves of whatever project you're working on before you had to pay like a couple $100 for a license for this software, if not more than that. I don't remember what it cost. So yeah. Some people did have access to cool tools, and the robots looked really nice. For people who didn't, like me, they had things that looked kind of like this. Now moving on to the drive systems, where the Walmart reference comes into. I don't actually like to shop at Walmart anymore, and I frankly don't like Amazon much better, but that's a random political rant. What this thing is here is a HandyWorks drill, and these were the motors that Mini Flash used, and I believe a handful of other 12-pound robots used them. It was actually my one contribution to the sport of robotic combat back then. I don't know who actually made these things, but they were essentially a Walmart exclusive. They were cheap. I want to say about $15 US for the entire cordless drill kit. They had a 450 RPM no load speed at 4.8 volts, and they were quite happy at running at 7.2 volts. And this is what they were. They were a very basic brushed cordless drill that I'm sure in here were probably plastic gears. I may have opened up one of these at one point, but I know that's kind of a no-no now, even for Beetleweight robots, but the forces involved back then were a lot less than they are today, and they worked pretty darn good, and because they were so cheap, anybody could afford them, not just the people who had the money to buy real tools like DeWalt branded tools and use their motors. When it came to the speed controllers, this is where things got even maybe less janky, because this is an actual speed controller for RC equipment, but it's from an RC car. And I mentioned a moment ago about 7.2 volts. That was important because I actually ran in here for its drive system a 7.2 volt rechargeable NiCad battery, because pretty much the entire RC car industry ran on 7.2 volts. And these aren't necessarily bad speed controllers for RC cars. The problem is RC car speed controllers have a reverse delay built into them. So if you were driving forward and want to go in reverse, you had to wait about a second before this thing would kick in and let the motor go in reverse. The idea is that the speed controller didn't want to accidentally damage the motor by allowing a quick reverse, which is fine for RC cars, but not really good for combat robots. Unless you were trying to twitch and avoid the enemy weapon, you couldn't do that. Let's move on to the weapon system. Now the motor I have in here showed up on the surplus market in the early 2000s, and it was one of those things that's bought up like crazy by combat robot builders. There's two versions. One was called the Mini EV motor, named after a smaller version of the EV Warrior motor. This one I got here was what I like to call the Mini Jensen, kind of named after the Jensen motor, another popular lightweight combat robot motor. I think it weighs about a pound, is approximately 1 horsepower. I think this one had 18,000 RPMs, and you can do the math to figure out what the appropriate stall torque was. I don't know, I don't care. And the weapon system up here was a nice 7¼ inch saw blade, because that was cool back then. So in the early 2000s, flipper robots weren't really a thing. Vertical spinners were kind of starting to show up, but the kind of monsters we have today that can launch a robot into the ceiling, that wasn't really a thing. So the fact is, saw blades were still pretty durable enough to take hits and survive combat. They didn't do much damage, but they looked ferocious. For the hub on the saw blade, I've actually got some sort of, it's like just a random surplus gear, because a lot of these parts here actually came from the surplus market. I don't think I mentioned that just quite yet. Surplus, surplus, surplus. The bearing blocks, also surplus. So I'd have to basically drill holes through the gear, line them up with some holes I had drilled in the saw, and that acted as a halfway decent hub. And you know, it all worked pretty well with some sort of timing belt up here. I wouldn't be surprised if these sprockets came from different surplus stores. I just happened to get lucky and get the correct proper timing. And then I think I would have to do there may have been like a tensioning pulley in here to hold this tension in place, or I might have actually at some point drilled these holes in a certain spot to get the tension correctly, and just over the 20 years this thing's been sitting on here, it's relaxed a little bit. But you know, saws are cool back then. I don't use them now. They will just shatter at the slightest impact they get. There's a reason why even these little buggers are running AR-500 weapons, and this thing is, you know, 1 pound. Let's talk about electronics. Now I mentioned the drive system ran on a 7.2 volt system. However, the weapon motor was 12 volts and really wanted 12 volts to reach its full potential. So there's actually a second battery in here that's 4 sub-C cells. And so this is a 4.8 volt cell pack right here, and it combined in a sort of separate circuit with a 7.2 volt system to provide 12 volts to the weapon motor. So in between fights, I would have to either replace 2 batteries or charge both of them up independently. It was a cluster of a system, but it kind of worked. There's also 2 big honking relays in here, because just like now when you get to some of these larger weight classes, you have to have the ability to remotely kill the robot, and also you had to have a way obviously to turn the weapon on and off as needed. This weapon is not under a speed control, it is under a relay. So it's a 12 volt relay to turn that on and off, and then a separate 12 volt relay which was the master RC kill switch for the robot itself. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing the RC kill switch mechanism that's still in here, just the relays in here. But I had a custom built system made from an RC servo where I took the RC servo circuit board out and I ran like a diode in line with the motor controllers, and somehow that worked to control this relay. That's right, now that controlled the 5 volt relay, which in turn then controlled this 12 volt relay. And that was perfectly fine back then. In fact, the NERC had me write up a newsletter article about how I built that and published that, so you can find that somewhere, that circuit for that diagram. There is one dedicated combat robot part in this entire robot, and it's hiding in this foam block right here to protect it because it was kind of expensive. Team Delta, they made Hazard, a medium weight combat robot, and probably a few others, sold a series of RC switches. I want to say they were like $30, $40 US back in the day. But they were a simple circuit board that would take in an RC signal and turn a switch on or off. And this is what controlled the master power for the robot, that I can then turn the robot on and off with my RC controller. When it came to the required master link or master switch, I didn't actually have a master switch in this robot. Large current switches that could be easily turned on and off were a thing back then. There's something called the Hella switch. I had one in a 30-pound robot. It was a marine grade bolt switch, but oftentimes it was easier just to use a master link. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there was two voltage systems, 7.2 and 12 volts in here. So that's why there's 4 different circuits or 4 different connectors. 2 of them were for the 7.2 system, 2 of them were for the 12 volt system, and you just pull this thing out and the robot would be dead with a manual switch. Finally, we're going to move on to the RC system. Now, this used an FM radio. Back then, you had ground radio and you had aircraft radios. It's still technically today for FCC rules, but it's not that big of a deal because everyone runs on 2.4 gigahertz or one of those other frequencies up there. But ground radios for RC cars and whatnot were in most 3 channels, and to operate this guy, you needed, I needed all 6, really. It was kind of interesting because I did tank steer with the 2 sticks, and then I had to have a weapon and then the master kill switch, all that fun stuff. So what you had to do is purchase a aircraft radio, which then the person selling you to it would modify it to be compatible with ground frequencies, which they could do, but it would cost extra. And then they'd have to sell you a compatible ground frequency receiver. FM radios had a really long antenna that was obnoxious to use, and metal blocked the FM radio signals. So there was a dedicated Lexan section right here, which would go ahead and would actually allow the radio signals relatively through. Okay, but then there's also this fantastic little invention, a whip antenna. That was a way to have a somewhat durable antenna for your robot that could be outside the robot and not get easily caught in something or get ripped apart. It was a fantastic little invention, man. It's so nice today with the 2.4 gigahertz, which can basically go through nearly anything, and frequency hopping. Oh, and don't forget frequency clips. So before you turned your robot on, you had to go to a board and take off a little, usually like a clothes hanger, and that would indicate that you were taking that frequency, and then therefore you would have that so that if you turned your robot on, you knew you would be fine. If you turned your radio on without that clip, you could get disqualified or some other penalty because you could interfere with other robots, and it was quite dangerous. Therefore, you're actually required to bring along multiple crystals in the offbeat chance that you and your opponent had the same crystal frequency for both your radio and your receiver. And one other thing I want to point out in here on the topic of radios is that fail-safe systems were not automatically built into the RC systems. I have a separate one added on here, and this guy did the job. If it ever detected a loss of signal, it would cut the power to the Team Delta switch, which would then in turn cut power to the robot. Two last quick notes here. The first is, with 3-inch wheels or so, this robot is not invertible, and frankly, that wasn't that big of a deal back then. As I mentioned before, vertical spinners weren't that powerful, flippers weren't really a thing yet. There were a few robots with lifters that could flip you over. Al Kindle from Blacksmith these days, he had a 12-pound robot called Tyrant Jr. I fought him back in, I think, 2001, and he did defeat me by flipping me over on my back. So it was a thing that could happen, but it was so uncommon that it really wasn't worth designing for it like it is today. Also, I remember now why I had this Lexan panel back here. This is some top armor off a different version of Mini Flash, but it's sheet steel, and just this thin steel would have wreaked havoc with radio signals, and that's why you wanted as much polycarbonate or some sort of plastic as you possibly could in these robots to allow that through. And then the last thing I just want to toss out there as a possible option if people would be interested in this, I wouldn't be against refurbishing this robot to be kind of like as it is now, but in a functional position with maybe a little bit more modern gear in case you want to see what an old robot like this performed like in terms of, say, damage output. I'll give you a hint, it's not very good. But hey, you never know. So if you want to see that, drop a comment down in the comment sections below and possibly I'll get around to that project. Alright, so until next time, I'm Jason, the captain of Team Rocket Robotics. I want to thank you all for watching.